Hello, listeners. Welcome to IT Guy Who Lifts podcast. I'm your host, Palash Gupta, Diploma in Nutrition and Fitness Sciences from INFS India, and Bachelor's in Sports and Exercise Science from Loughborough University, UK. The goal of this podcast is to understand science and science based tools with the help of industry experts so that we can further optimize our training and nutrition program. With that in mind, let's jump right into today's podcast. So, I have two questions on the very same topic which you just beautifully described. The first one is just as you mentioned that bodybuilder studies who are having a low fiber intake, some kind of a dysbiosis was happening and they were losing some kind of a diversity in their microbiome. So, does that loss of diversity of microbiome is on a similar scale when someone becomes lactose intolerant, or you can say gluten intolerant over the time period of not having any interaction with lactase, milk sugar basically, and the gluten? That is my first question. That is it reversible? Because once you become lactose intolerant, it becomes really, really hard to readjust, or you become intolerant to the gluten as well. So does that similar case applies to the microbiome, or is it reversible in nature when it comes to the microbiome? That the moment we start having those kind of a fibers or those indigestible carbohydrates, those diversity of those particular specific microbiomes start regenerating again and then start residing in our gut again.
Mhm. Yeah, it's similar in a way in that we are producing the lactase enzyme in response to ingesting lactose.
Yeah,
And so our body is not going to be expressing genes to make proteins that it doesn't need. That would be super inefficient. So if a person were to, sometimes we just age out of producing lactase,
yeah,
and other times it's because we aren't consuming things that include lactose, and so we just aren't expressing that gene. So it's sort of like it's made on demand. So it's similar in the sense that if we are not providing nutrients for these microbes, and some of them have very specific needs, that just like any living organism, if you don't provide it with food, it will die. And so when we have these microbes that are have a sort of they have a short lifespan, they have high and specific energy needs, that they will relatively quickly die off because they don't have the energy available, or perhaps there's another group of microbes that's competing for that same nutrient and outcompetes. So there is,
yeah,
just like when we're looking at any sort of ecosystem, there's going to be competition for nutrients and for real. So yes, in the sense that like if we're not giving the stimulus for growth, then they will not thrive. The um, the information that we have on sort of rebound of microbiomes is still really limited. And we have kind of two forms of rebound and two forms of like a loss of diversity. We can look at the taxonomic, which is just the population, just the which microbes are there, which die off and which come back. And then we can look at the functionality, which are the genes that are available and being expressed. So we may have a loss of taxonomic diversity, but have no change in functional diversity. So some microbes die off, but the others are still have a full array of genes, and are expressing them in response to what they need to be doing because of these new nutrients. So that's like one kind of confounding, or a little bit of like a confusing way of looking at it. What matters more, the which microbes
yeah,
are there, or like which genes are present and being expressed. But when we look at things like rebound after antibiotics, it looks like the microbes or the groups that rebound, those that come back after the antibiotics are finished, that level of rebound really depends on the baseline microbiome. So if you have, a very diverse microbiome at baseline, and then you take antibiotics, then you might have a more rapid rebound theoretically. But the other thing is you could get sort of a rebound to a new steady state. So it's a different set of microbes, but the functionality is the same because, they, even though the activities of microbes are strain or subspecies specific, they do have a lot of redundancy. So we've seen that with antibiotic studies. And even with interventions, like if a person does exercise and they see an increase in these butyrate producers, these beneficial microbes, cool. Then once they stop exercising, they usually will revert back to baseline or something similar to it. So we have like, it's just kind of like, we respond to our lifestyle habits. If we're
Yeah,
moving around more and eating differently, we're going to look a different way. And then if we go back to what we were doing before, we're going to look like we did before. So it's kind of the same thing with this population, except that we could have multiple versions of a microbial ecosystem that works well for us, that does what it's supposed to do.
definitely. And my second question was that uh, what happens when we stop providing them those indigestible carbohydrate and they start chipping our intestinal mucus layer, right? What are the repercussions that we are bound to face in that case?
Mhm. We don't have as much data in humans. I mean, we have seen some thinning of the mucus layer or just an increase in gene expression that they would use to break down that mucus layer. But in rodents, they have actually seen significant loss of that mucus layer, and they also become increasingly susceptible to pathogen infection. So it could be
Mm,
that it is reducing our immune defense because that mucus layer is really a
makes sense.
physical, it's a physical barrier. Yeah. So if that becomes very thin, then we could have microbes getting down to the absorptive cells or the immune cells beneath and potentially translocating, so leaking between the intestinal cells or causing some form of immune response. So probably not a good thing, but we just don't have a lot of data on humans because it's very hard to get images of the intestinal mucus layer in a human, who's alive and stuff.
Definitely, definitely. Really, really good explanation. I hope listeners will get a lot of productive point from that. And so, with that segue, there is one other word which has been thrown around a lot, that brain-gut connection, right? Brain-gut connection, connection to the sleep quality, connection to the exercise-induced GI stress and all. So, what is this brain-gut connection? Would you like to throw some light on it?
Sure. That again is something that is not well understood. There's quite a lot of hype around it. And what happens when we
Yeah,
have sort of these new areas that are not well understood and there's a lot of potential there, we get a lot of publications that are sort of like narrative in nature and they're theoretical. And those are really important because they are borrowing maybe from mouse studies or from in
mm,
vitro studies to say, here's a potential mechanism, but then that often gets extrapolated to this is must be what's exactly what's happening in humans. So like that's happening with the estrobolome right now, like the microbiome estrogen connection, that we have a ton of these narrative reviews and then people are speaking about that as though those theories have been hypotheses have been tested and whatnot. So it's just something to keep in mind when we're looking at the gut brain connection. But what we've seen from rodent studies thus far is that rodents who are reared without any microbes at all, germ-free rodents, they have abnormal brain and immune development and just development in general. So the microbiome probably plays some role in brain development, and they've done fecal transplant studies, transplanting feces from one rodent to another rodent or from a human to a rodent, and then observed potential changes in their behavior. But the issue there is that how are we actually able to determine if a rodent is displaying autism-like behaviors or
yeah.
depressive-like behaviors, anxiety-like behaviors? So it's not really meant to be an exact extrapolation to humans. It's just meant to observe, are there some behavioral changes occurring? But those studies are arguably a little bit low in quality and their ability to be translated. But, there still is very likely, some influence on behavior. So the sort of anatomical connection between the brain and the gut is mostly via the vagus nerve. So that it runs the majority of our parasympathetic nervous system. So we have that connection, and then the gut has its own sort of nervous system, the enteric nervous system, that operates separately from the brain and helps to regulate sort of um, um, automatic reactions of the gut as food is moving through. And then we also have peripheral connections via the production of various neurotransmitters, some of which might be able to either like precursors might be able to cross the blood brain barrier. But the neurotransmitters that are used in the gut are really specific to the gut, even though they look the same as the ones that we have in the brain. So like serotonin is the one that comes up
Yeah.
all the time, but gut-derived serotonin is produced via a different enzymatic pathway and is a discrete pool in the gut, and it regulates gut motility. And the serotonin that we have in the brain is its own discrete pool that's produced via a different pathway and regulates mood and behavior. So there's not a direct connection where like, if you have dysbiosis, it's causing your mood disorder. But we do tend to see that there's a strong relationship between mood disorders and irritable bowel syndrome.
Yeah.
So there's a strong co-occurrence between those two, and there's certainly there's other influences of stress, whether it's like mental stress or exercise stress on GI function as well. But we have to keep in mind also that that brain gut connection, looking at GI function, that is not a brain microbiome connection directly, right? Because we're looking at GI function, we're looking at the function of those tissues, not the activity of the microbes themselves.
Mm.
So these microbes, they can produce small amounts of certain neurotransmitters and precursors to neurotransmitters, but we still don't have a clear picture of the how much that influences actual brain activity. It could be that they're more active in the periphery rather than in the.
Definitely, because even if we see any kind of anecdotal evidence that you are if a person is having any kind of a digestive issues, there are impairment in their sleep quality. There will be some kind of a impairment in their sleep quality, their general lifestyle, their mood disorders will be there. Exercise definitely will get impacted. So when we say that brain gut connection, it's a brain micro connection. It's basically a general gut connection, like your general gut is not on a good manner and all, which is why you are facing difficulty in sleeping or having a quality sleep or having a quality exercise session because of that,
Yeah,
right?
and we also have to keep in mind that people with mood disorders may have different dietary patterns.
Yeah.
So, one area that has been a popular topic would be dysbiosis associated with autism spectrum disorder. But what has been sort of failed to be mentioned or pointed out is that individuals with autism spectrum disorder often have very restrictive repetitive diet. So they have very low dietary diversity. And a recent analysis just came out that really pointed to that and indicated that most likely the characteristic differences that we see in especially children with autism versus the controls is that the children with autism have a very different and very limited dietary pattern. And it's most likely that, and it's not that the microbiome is playing a causative role in the manifestation of their autism symptom.
Definitely, definitely. And on a similar note, what are the effects of exercise on gut microbiome? Would you like to throw some light on that as well?
Yeah, we actually have so few studies on that we really can't like make any sort of confident statements because all but I believe two studies have failed to control for, oh no, all but four studies have failed to control for dietary patterns, looking at the influence of
Hmm.
exercise. And two of those found a possible direct influence of physical activity on the microbiome, and two did not. So right now it's kind of like a 50-50 split. Like, does exercise even have a direct effect on the microbiome? And if so, what type of exercise and to what extent, and does the influence matter that much? But what we do see is that individuals who are more physically active tend to have increased microbial diversity and a high representation of butyrate producers. But it could be because they are also eating high carbohydrate diets, and those
Yeah,
butyrate producers are preferentially utilizing carbohydrates to make butyrate. So yeah, we still just don't know. But recent research has kind of looked into some interesting stuff, like I had mentioned with the converting lactate to propionate. And there are certain microbes that have been identified in elite marathoners that are at higher levels than what we would see in sedentary controls. So it kind of just points to like maybe exercise might not be influencing like the microbiome as a whole, because we have to remember we're looking at the tens of trillions of microbes and these, 200 and some thousand genes that we're probably not going to be able to establish a causative relationship between the whole microbiome and anything. That's like looking at, what are, like, I've used this analogy before. That's like saying vertebrates cause climate change. Like, which vertebrates? We can't be looking at like all of the whole microbiome. That's not gonna that's not gonna be helpful for us. So what we really need to do is start to tease out, the microbes of interest based on observational studies. And then we can utilize those in rodent studies and see if there's, sort of a proof of concept here,
Yeah,
that, something could happen in humans, and then find some way of, applying that to humans. And we've done that with a few different things, but it just doesn't look like the results that we see in rodents are almost always way more significant than what we see in humans,
yep,
because we're just more complex organisms and our microbiomes are so complex. So when we're talking about like these cause effect relationships, like the microbiome itself is just too complex. And eventually we're going to have to start looking at, specific microbes. And that's where we're going to really be able to develop helpful interventions rather than trying to like, do this whole blunt object kind of thing.
definitely. So have you came across this study? I was reading this study, like it came out in September of 2021, that a group of researchers took rodents, and they induced antibiotic-induced dysbiosis in them, and that impairs the type 2 fiber hypertrophy when the volume load is matched. So
Mm-hmm.
does that ring some bells in your ears? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the so there is potentially, there's this sort of gut muscle
yeah,
axis,
yeah,
and they've looked
yeah,
at how, yeah, and that's like one of the potential implications of sarcopenia. We're losing
yeah,
microbial diversity
anorexia.
over time, right? Exactly. So it could be play that role in age-related muscle loss. One thing that we noticed that we didn't like publish about, but we had some of our rodents in exercise studies. So we put them on a treadmill and, have them run for however long. And we had rodents that were normal, and then we had these transgenic TLR4 knockout mice. So TLR4 is a what's called a pattern associated molecular, what is it? But it's a PAMP. Anyway, it's there to recognize like microbe associated compounds like endotoxins like lipopolysaccharide. So when we knock that out, we are basically knocking out one aspect of the innate immune system. And TLR4 and the immune system in general play a role, as I mentioned, in exercise adaptation. So post-exercise, we have this sort of inflammatory spike, increases in IL-6, and during exercise, we have the production of reactive oxygen species. And if we suppress that, we knock that down, we don't adapt to exercise.
Yeah,
So it does make sense that if we, incur severe dysbiosis or just, like a loss of the microbial community, that it could potentially reduce the adaptation to exercise through immune suppression. So we're not having that
yep.
response, or maybe, there's some role associated with like the, metabolic flexibility of skeletal muscle. But yeah, it was really interesting to see how that all kind of ties in together.
Definitely. So all in all, we can make the inferences that gut health is really, really important for everyone, and especially for athletes who are looking to get their optimization of their training and nutrition program. And in order to optimize the gut health, I think fiber is almost non-negotiable. Even if you are in a realm of ketogenic diet, you have to make sure that you are getting some good quality soluble and insoluble fibers through your dietary mediums, right? Correct
Yeah,
me if I'm wrong.
absolutely.
That is the good recommendation, or would you like to add some points on it?
That's my top recommendation, is to try to eat a variety of plants. So it doesn't have to be grains, but that's an obvious one. But fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, like beans, nuts, all of those are sources of prebiotics. So the fibers that are used preferentially by beneficial microbes, and then just microbe accessible carbs in general. And it looks like also having those sort of in balance with your protein intake. So if you have high protein intake, then you probably will need a relatively high plant intake as well. So something like the
Okay.
carnivore diet would be the opposite of what you should do. Like that's not
Yeah.
going to be, that is probably going to have some negative effects, if not immediately, then certainly down the line. And the addition of fermented foods is something that's still being studied, because there are like, they've got like fermented dairy is considered a probiotic food, but other fermented foods, with the exception of that one recent study that compared fermented foods with fiber, they just haven't really been studied very well in isolation. But if that's something that a person would want to do, it's probably not going to be harmful to them. Just know that it's a little bit overhyped right now. And even in that fermented food versus fiber study, those people were healthy. They had inflammatory markers in the normal range at baseline and after the intervention. And so, like, fiber is not inflammatory, and fermented foods are not going to be anti-inflammatory. You went from healthy to healthy. So that's, I think it's also important to sort of look at that in like terms of clinical relevance. Were these
Yeah.
people unhealthy? Did they have high inflammatory markers? And then this resolved that? Like, no. And there was no control group. So we don't know whether those markers would have just changed over time
Yep.
anyway, as do. But then in addition to that, just, regular physical activity, because that could potentially also be supportive of microbial diversity. Um, and limiting alcohol intake and not smoking. So it's kind of like the basics, of like just health and well-being also apply to the gut microbiome.
Definitely. And does this recommendation of 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories goes well as per your recommendation as well?
Yeah, in the US, we usually recommend like 25 grams a day for females and 38 for males, but it just kind of depends on which agency, and that is a little bit more modifiable. If a person's
Yep.
eating 4,000 calories a day, then their fiber intake will be a little bit higher. But yeah, 14 to 15 grams per 1,000 calories a day.
And does timing matters? Because the reason I'm asking this question of timing is when we see a diet chart, like if we are just taking a snapshot of your MyFitnessPal app, right? And it's showing that you are consuming 40 to 50 grams of fibers, then you are good to go. But does the timing matters, right? The reason I'm asking is I'm taking my own case studies. I was having 30 to 40 grams of fibers. Everything was, it looks good on paper, but those fibers were not coming into the play until later in the day. So I was waking up, I was having just one protein shake because I have to wake up and just go to the training first thing in the morning because of the busy schedule. Then I go train, then I come back because we all are meatheads, even though we are science mediators. So we definitely will minimize our fiber intake in our post-workout window. So fiber is not there as well. And then my fiber comes into the play at the really, really later into the day. And because of that, it might be because of that, or it might be some other circumstances. I was having issues like IBS, leaky gut, and all. So I then went back to the drawing board and then see that what were the things that I have changed. And I have figured out, okay, on a snapshot, I was having the similar amount of fiber, but the timings have been changed. And the moment I started including just 2 to 3 grams of really, really bioavailable psyllium husk, or you can say psyllium husk powder or soluble fiber with my protein shake, everything's came back to the normal. So does this have any kind of a correlation and causation as well? I just wanted to clarify with that with you.
Yeah, I haven't seen any studies on the effects of timing, so that it like
Yeah.
fiber timing specifically. Psyllium husk is an evidence-based recommendation to
Yep.
alleviate constipation, so that like in and of itself makes sense. But in terms of timing, there is a circadian rhythm to the microbiome. So
Okay.
the time of fecal sample collection can certainly affect what might be in greater abundance, because we have a bloom of microbes that can withstand the overnight fast, or a die off of those that have higher energy needs, and then in the morning or whenever a person starts eating, once food has reached the colon, then there's going to be an influx of microbes in response to the nutrient availability. So it would be interesting to see whether like fiber timing would make a difference in the same way that food timing might make a difference. If a person is like fasting for most of the day and they only have a 4-hour eating window, that could influence the microbiome, just because of the shortened eating window, not necessarily because of like the, intermittent fasting itself,
Yep.
but just, like, okay, these microbes have 4 hours to eat and then you're fasting for a much longer period of time. But yeah, it would be interesting to see, whether that makes a difference. Does it need to be distributed throughout the day, or does like a little bit of, time without it matter that much?
Definitely. So, with that segue, one more question I have that do low energy intake over the long period of time, because we have been in a physique competition and we do get our clients who are interested in and who do physique competition where they are in a deficit for a long period of time. A lot of the general population, females especially in our society, they are in a some kind of a diet anyway, like till their lifetime they are in some kind of a diet, whether it's a yo-yo diet, they binge and then cycle of feast and famine continues or not, that's a different scale. But some kind of a low energy availability over the long period of time, does that hampers the gut health in your regard?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have, again, a consensus on the influence of an
Even
energy deficit.
even the anecdotal evidence that you have seen in your clients or in yourself.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, in terms of just like GI
Yeah, yeah.
distress. So actually it's not as well known, but some GI complaints like feeling very bloated, kind of like chronically feeling bloated without necessarily having like objective bloating, but like the,
Mm,
kind of chronically complaining of feeling bloated, or a constipation, like really chronic constipation. It doesn't have another known cause. Those
yep.
are potential red flags for disordered eating. So individuals with restrictive eating disorders tend to have GI issues like constipation, in part because they have such low food volume going in, but also because GI motility can slow down. And so they'll
Yep.
feel constipated and things like that. So that can certainly play a role. And then if a person is eating a very low energy intake, and so they're having like low fiber intake, or, they're eating a very low carb diet, that could potentially influence the microbiome and could also influence GI distress, just having, constipation. Or if people are using a lot of diet products that have sugar alcohols, that have like chicory root fiber, those can cause diarrhea and a lot of gas and bloating. So some of the dietary, the habits around dieting and weight loss can cause GI distress. And in terms of energy availability, that could influence the microbiome. We also see changes in individuals who have lost weight, but it's impossible to determine whether that's because they've changed their body composition or because of energy deficit or potentially both. Looking at individuals who have anorexia nervosa, extremely low energy intake, we've seen both increases and reductions in microbial diversity. So again, it kind of matters whether we're looking at total numbers or relative abundance. And it could be that it's the energy deficit. It could be the specific foods that they're eating or excluding, because, we're going to have microbes that can thrive and adapt to that environment and others that are going to die off. So so probably, the impact of a person's energy deficit on the microbiome is also going to coincide with whatever they're eating, their physical activity habits, and things like that. And even at the end of the day, like if we were to say, extreme energy deficit has, increases microbial diversity, great, but does an increase in microbial diversity really cause a net benefit if the person's life has and the quality of life has been so
Yep.
reduced, because they've got this crazy energy deficit, they're super tired, they have no energy to do things. Maybe they developed like a micronutrient deficiency, because they're only eating 1,000 calories a day or whatever, but like, oh, increase microbial diversity. So, as much as we talk about microbial diversity and are assuming that it's probably a good thing, we could potentially, it's kind of a Goldilocks effect. You can have too little microbial diversity, because that is at some point is going to cause a reduction in functional diversity. You could potentially also have too much microbial diversity so that you don't have that increased relative abundance of neutral and beneficial microbes. You have kind of everyone's on a level playing field, and that actually can make things less stable. But we don't have a number, we don't have like a reference for an ideal level of diversity. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that like increased microbial diversity is a metric that we've associated with positive outcomes,
Yeah.
but we don't actually know what the clinical effects are. Even when we see the loss of bifidobacteria, which we see in people who are on the elimination phase of a low FODMAP diet, well, they feel better. So, like, does the temporary reduction in bifidobacteria matter that much clinically if they feel a lot better? And then when we give them, nutrients, or excuse me, when we give them FODMAPs afterwards, that number comes back up. So we also have to look at like, how much that actually matters in the grand scheme of things and long term, to determine like what's most important.
Definitely, because the reason I came up with that question is during a contest prep or during a long dieting phase, we can see significant reduction in the frequency of the bowel movement, right? Because the energy, the food volume is low, and we have all been through the physique contest prep where we have experienced that once in a or a twice in a week. The max I have gone, uh, the lowest frequency that I have experienced is once in a week. So I was like, does pooping really exist at that particular point of time? So I'm like, okay, it's actually saving me enough time so that I can do my office work and all. So, but it's a different kind of experience when you go through a physique contest prep, and then it's how it makes you walk the walk before you talk the talk.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I mean,
so.
it's so intrusive in like every possible way, it was day-to-day, bowel comfort. So yeah, yeah. And, even in bowel movement frequency or bowel movement consistency is also associated with, sort of different levels of microbial diversity.
Yep.
So it could be that if a person has, chronic diarrhea, that they may be flushing out more of those luminal microbes than someone. So just another sign that like everything when we're trying to establish these relationships, it is really a chicken or the egg problem. Is the
Yep.
microbiome causing this, or is this causing changes to the microbiome, or is there no direct cause at all? It's just a relationship.
Definitely. So I would like you to touch upon few of the points that we have mentioned in this podcast, like IBS. You have mentioned IBS multiple amount of time. You have mentioned FODMAPs. So just a brief summary of what these terminologies are, so that our listeners can have a heads up, and so that they can further know about these things.
Sure.
What is
So
like IBS?
yeah, so I can give kind of like a overview of like the kind of
Yep.
key terms that we've used today. So IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. So that is a functional disease of the GI tract. The tissues look normal, but there is some difference in the function. So a person could have chronic diarrhea, constipation, or alternating, and they may also have a lot of abdominal pain, and they seem to be more sensitive to the bloating that's associated with gas production, and so they perceive a lot more pain. Inflammatory bowel disease is an organic disease, so that refers to both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. So in this case, it's an autoimmune disease where the body is actually attacking the tissues of the intestines, and it can lead to ulcers, and certainly also negatively affects nutrient absorption. And then FODMAP stands for fermentable oligo-di-monosaccharide and polyol. And those are specific types of dietary carbohydrates that are either very fermentable or attract a lot of water to the gut, so they can cause bloating and diarrhea. And then dysbiosis is another umbrella term that just refers to either an imbalanced microbiome, but even that is very ambiguous. But it's actually just any change compared to the control group in a study. So dysbiosis can mean all sorts of different things. Usually has a negative connotation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And then eubiosis, which I didn't mention, but that would be the opposite of dysbiosis. It's kind of like
Okay.
the balanced microbiome. But again, we don't know what that looks like because healthy looks different from person to person. So hopefully that kind of gives people a good rundown of the terms I use today.
Definitely. So we'll be having a really quick rapid fire session. So
Sure.
where you'll be answering like 1 to 2 sentence for the questions that I will ask and their beneficiality for
Okay.
our layman terms or our population. So what are prebiotics and probiotics, and are they actually beneficial to invest our money upon? So that's the first question. Just a
Yeah.
brief introduction of prebiotics and probiotics and their usefulness.
Okay. So prebiotics are energy sources used preferentially by beneficial microbes. Usually, we're talking about fibers that are going to be used by them for energy, and we can find those in plants. So we don't need to supplement with them. And yes, they are definitely beneficial. Probiotics are live microorganisms that, when ingested in adequate amounts, confer some benefit to the host, and they can be beneficial in specific applications, mostly for reducing diarrhea associated with antibiotics or traveling, but they do have some other applications.
Definitely. Really great answer. The second one is, what are the differences between allergies versus intolerances? And how can people find out the difference, whether they are having allergies versus the intolerances?
Yeah. So an allergy is an immune response to certain proteins in a food that can be life-threatening and can lead to things like hives and anaphylactic shock, or even just rashes around the mouth and extreme GI distress, like immediate vomiting and diarrhea. An intolerance occurs when we are not producing the digestive enzyme to break down a food. And that is usually going to be related to the carbohydrates in a food, but not always. But the most common would be lactose intolerance. So we're not producing lactase. And that's not life threatening. It's just going to lead you to have some gas and bloating and some diarrhea if you eat a food that you have an intolerance for. If you suspect a food allergy, you should go to an allergist or an immunologist. They will gather your history. They can do some tests if you suspect an allergy that can help to confirm whether the allergy might actually be real, but they don't have diagnostic tests for allergies.
Okay, really great answer. Really informative. And the third one is impact of artificial sweetness on our gut health. And are they the ones we should be afraid of, or we can use them sparingly?
In human studies, we haven't seen an effect of artificial sweeteners on the microbiome or gut derived hormones. They are recognized as safe, and in the amounts that we're eating them or
Yep,
drinking them, they're not going to affect human health. Sugar alcohols, which are non nutritive sweeteners, are for the most part very fermentable and also attract a lot of water, so they can cause gas and bloating and diarrhea.
definitely. So there are no issues in incorporating those artificial sweetness, right? As of now, as per the evidence which stands right now, right?
Right. Yep. We have evidence in humans that is very different from what we would see in rodents. We often see significant perturbations in rodents, but we don't see the same thing in humans.
Definitely. And the next question will be effect of these green supplements that you have been hearing, right? The greens powder, superfoods, and all, and even the fiber supplements. These kind of a supplements, are they play any beneficial role, or should we just cater to the good old regular food on our plate? So,
Yeah.
what importance of the supplementation of greens powder and fiber supplements?
So greens powders are usually a combination of some grasses and herbs and extracts from fruits and vegetables. They usually have some blend of probiotics and sometimes digestive enzymes. So there haven't been any studies that have looked at greens powders specifically on their role on the gut microbiome. But when we look at studies from dehydrated, like fruit and vegetable powders, in most cases, those are really poorly done studies. So they're very low quality because they're not blinded, and the way that they're measuring and analyzing their data might not be appropriate either. The use of probiotics really needs to be targeted to like, probiotics have very specific effects that we know of at this point. And for the most part, digestive enzymes, especially if they don't have an enteric coating,
Yep.
are just going to be denatured in the stomach. So that's not going to be helpful either. So it's basically taking like you're taking a powdered multivitamin with a bunch of like nonsense added. So it's better to just eat, the fruits and vegetables and things like that. And in terms of fiber supplements, as I mentioned, psyllium husk can
Yep.
ease constipation. And then there's partially hydrolyzed guar gum, which isn't really a fiber supplement, but it is it is a soluble fiber. It's a gum, but anyway, people don't use that really like as often as they do like psyllium husk or like
Silimus.
or something. But that can also ease constipation, and it is considered a prebiotic, but it's not highly fermentable. So it could be an energy source for those microbes, but it won't lead to a lot of gas production. So that could potentially be beneficial as well. But the other one that's not fermentable, methyl cellulose, it's not going to be a useful energy source for the microbes, but it can also ease constipation.
Definitely great. The next question will be, what are the resistant starches, right? We see this term thrown around a lot. People are really confused about these terms. So what are the resistant starches, like eating cold food or reheated food? What are the implication of that? Or should we be worried about these things, or like do they have actually its practical significance? Or
So resistant starches are starch. So unlike dietary fiber, the carbon atoms are linked together with bonds that our enzymes can't act on. Like naturally, that's how they're
okay,
found. But resistant starches, that is starch, which we normally would be able to break down, but through the process of heating and cooling, some of those bonds have been changed, the chemical bonds, so that our enzymes don't work on them, but the microbes can still break them down and metabolize them. So resistant starches are considered also to be an energy source for the microbes because they resist our own digestion. So that would be, the amount of resistant starch that you get, in heating and cooling potatoes or rice is probably so incredibly low that it's really not worth the effort of the repeated
okay,
bouts of heating and cooling. But if you have, but they can also be found naturally. So just like if you're heating and cooling your potatoes like we do when we're doing meal prep or whatever, maybe you have a
yep.
little bit more resistant starch. So it's not anything harmful, but it's probably not worth like putting a lot of effort into trying to produce.
Yeah, definitely. When people, especially those athletic population, hears about that, if you are heating or cooling your potatoes and rice multiple times, that those are converting into resistant starch, and they think that all the nutritional profile or the properties of that food is getting lost, and our food is getting eaten by the bacterias and not by us. So that was a really good eye opener for them. So we'll be wrapping up this podcast with one last question. What are the health best practices that we need to follow, both as a practitioner and both as a clients, or you can say general population, in order to make sure that we can optimize our gut health, and so that in turn optimize our training and nutritional outcome? What are the best practices that you recommend?
Yeah, foundationally would be in, eating a wide variety of plant-based foods. So basically eating, one or two plants at each meal and snack is ideal. Engaging in regular physical activity that's not incredibly strenuous, but is enough to be considered, moderate
Yep.
intensity most days of the week. Abstaining from smoking, using alcohol minimally. So, red wine a couple times a week might not be harmful, could be potentially beneficial, but ideally not more than that. And only targeted use of probiotics as needed. If you are prescribed antibiotics, take them as directed. Don't just stop early because that could lead to antimicrobial resistance. And don't take antibiotics for viral infections because that could
Oh,
also contribute. So only use antibiotics when appropriate. If you have a bacterial infection, use them as directed. And that's really about it.
that's great. That's great. I hope people can get a really good overview of about gut health, and as you like to call yourself as a gut health professional, not as a gut health expert, right? So I do believe that all the knowledge bombs that you have dropped in this podcast will be really, really beneficial, not only for me, but for my listeners as well. So, with that note, we are wrapping up this podcast. So, on that similar note, where can people find you and how can people reach out to you, Dr. Gabriel?
I'm on Instagram at Vitamin PhD, and I also have a website, vitaminphdnutrition.com, and they can check out all the podcasts, the book. I also run a webinar series now called Gut Health with Gab. So there's a monthly webinar, and I also have a Facebook community where I post bonus material and answer people's questions. And I also have other experts in there that are answering people's questions. So members can either drop in for just a 1 month, or a one webinar kind of event, or if they want to do a month to month membership, then they'll have access to the Facebook group and all of the webinar replays with their PDFs and Q&As. So we do different topics every month. I have guest speakers come on and speak about their area of expertise. It's all researchers and practitioners in the field, so keeping it very evidence-based.
Definitely. Love that ending note. So I'll be linking down all the references and the links that you have just mentioned in the description. And I do highly recommend that all the listeners who are listening this podcast do follow our evidence-based Wonder Woman. And I hope you do give out the audition for the Wonder Woman, because your personality, along with your professional and lifting endeavors, along with the multiple streams of the sports that you have trained in, whether it's jiu-jitsu, martial arts, and now the ice hockey as well, a lot of skills that you have conquered, you will be a really, really good fit, Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you.
So
Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks a lot for coming on the show. I hope people have really enjoyed a lot, and thanks for giving us your precious time from your precious schedule so that we can have this session of ours. So really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Hello, listeners. I hope you would have liked this episode of the podcast series. And if you did, please feel free to share it with your friends, families, and your colleagues so that they can also get benefit from the science based discussion that we just had. With that in mind, this podcast, along with all the episodes, is now available on all the major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, along with the audio visual media YouTube. So, with that in mind, let me bid adieu for this time, and I will see you in the next episode.